I'm trying so hard to get this to work. Hello, hello, hello! Welcome to my 2022 reading wrap-up and favorite books of the year video on youtube.com. Thank you so much for being here. Yay! In this video I'm going to talk about my reading stats for the year, as well as my 11 favorite books from 2022, or my 11 favorite books that I read in 2022, because I couldn't choose 10. So you have a little bonus one! I use the Storygraph to track my reading, and in 2022 my goal was to read 40 books, and I completed that goal! Yay! Which I'm really glad and proud of that, because in 2021 my goal was to read 50 books and I ended up only reading like 23, so I almost doubled the amount of books that I read in 2022, which is pretty cool, and I'm proud of myself for that. So of those 40 books, I read 11,769 pages. The mood of the books that I was reading, the top one is emotional, and then reflective, and then hopeful, which is pretty on track for me. This year I mainly read short and medium books. I didn't read any long books that are over 500 pages, which is kind of unfortunate, but it kind of makes sense because I was in my senior year of high school and then my freshman year of college, so I was very preoccupied. I had other priorities than reading. In 2023, I do want to read a few more big books because I have some large books on my TBR shelf that I want to clear off. In terms of fiction versus nonfiction, I read 88% fiction and 13% nonfiction, which is kind of surprising. I think that 13% nonfiction, most of it was for school. 2 of them were poetry collections. And it's like, poetry is nonfiction, but also like, is it? It doesn't feel like nonfiction, so it feels kind of weird to like put it in there, but you know. My top genre was LGBTQIA+, because I am me. Obviously, LGBTQIA+ is not a genre. Like, I say this all the time. So my actual top genres of the year were romance and contemporary, which I agree with, because I'm a romantic girly. That's what I like to read, and I'm very much geared towards contemporary stories because I'm not a fantasy girly. No matter how hard I try to be, I'm just not. And then after that is young adult, which is also not a genre, and then literary and classics. I love me a good literary fiction. But I did discover in the year of our Lord and Savior 2022 that I think my favorite genre is historical fiction. Like, you'll see a few historical fictions on my top 11 books of the year list that just make me happy. I feel like historical fiction just has everything that I need as a nerd. It has historical references to like real events, but still fictional characters that I can like suck my teeth into. That was kind of graphic, but you know. My most read authors for the year were Akwaeke, Emezi, and Joya Goffney. I read 2 of each of their books. I definitely do want to keep an eye on Akwaeke, Emezi. There's a few more books that they've written that are on my shelf or on my to-read list, because I definitely want to read more by Akwaeke, Emezi. They have a few books on their backlist that I'm interested in. And Joya Goffney, I will read anything she writes. I think I will read anything that she writes. Is she coming out with a new book? Yes. 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 Joya Goffney is coming out with another book in 2023. And I'm gonna read it because I read anything that she writes. And then here's my little, can I fit it in there? My little graph for each month and how many books and how many pages I read. I started off the year pretty bad. I didn't read any books in January. I think I was just going through a lot at that time in my life, and I was going through a reading slump. A lot of things were happening for me, so I didn't read anything. And I think I was really scared at that point that I wasn't going to be able to make my reading goals because I failed at them completely in 2021. I was feeling bad. But I'm glad I was able to get back into it. And I feel very confident about my reading now. I feel like I've found a way to incorporate it into my life even when I'm away at school and still, you know, enjoy reading, and it's a fun hobby. As for my ratings, my average rating was a 3.95 star, which isn't bad. I read a lot of books that I liked this year. I didn't rate as many 5 stars as I have previous years, which I'm kind of surprised by, but not really, because I feel like my rating system has gotten a lot harsher. If I just like a book, I'm not going to give it 5 stars. I think a lot about the books that I give 5 stars, and I don't give them out like candy canes. I don't tend to give 0 or 1 stars because if I hate a book that much, I'm just gonna stop reading it. But these 2 books that I gave 2 stars, like, I hated them. But I don't think they were like bottom of the barrel trash. I just disliked them a lot, and I was still able to finish them because they were relatively short. So yeah. Some fun little stats from my wrap up. My most shelved book that I read was The Great Gatsby by F. Scott Fitzgerald. Not surprised by. My least shelved book was my sociology textbook that I read for school. Obviously, only 2 users shelved it because I was the one who uploaded it onto the Storygraph, because I was not finna read that entire textbook, take notes on that entire textbook, and then not include it in my reading goal. And of course, the longest book I read was my sociology textbook with 448 pages, which I don't think is accurate. I feel like that book is 1,000 pages. I think it's over 1,000 pages. At least the ebook version is, which is the one I read. And then the shortest book I read was Antigone, the play by Sophocles, which it's a 1-act play, so of course it was 80 pages. And I also read this for school, and it was fine. And then the highest rated book on the Storygraph that I read in 2022 is If Not Winter, Fragments of Sappho, translated by and assembled by Anne Carson. This book has a rating of 4.48 stars on the Storygraph. It's funny that this is the highest rated book that I read. It's just a collection of Sappho poems that I read for class. That again, I was like, I read this entire thing, I might as well include it on my Storygraph. But yeah, I mean, it was good. It's Sappho, like, of course, obviously. And then I myself created like a Google spreadsheet so that I could make my own charts for some things that I wanted to record personally that I couldn't really put into the Storygraph. I prioritize, you know, diversity and reading diverse books from diverse authors and things like that. So I made this to kind of get a look at how my reading is, if there's any patterns, certain things like that. So the first one is authors, race, and ethnicity. 42.5% of the books I read were written by white authors, 27.5% were written by Black authors, 25% by Asian, 2.5% by Latina authors, or singular author because it was one book, and one book that was by undefined race, because that book was another book I read for school that was a collection of poems from the Bible. I think it was called The Song of Songs, and they were all written by women, but I have no idea what their ethnicity, race is. What race were the people who wrote the Bible? I think it's a variety, so I have no idea. And then I only read one Latina author and then 0 Native American or Indigenous authors, which is not cool. Yeah, I definitely need to prioritize in 2023 reading more Indigenous, more Latina authors, because I have None. Barely any of them, but I do have a few of them on my shelf, so I think I can do that in the next year. I feel like part of the reason why the white authors section is so large, I'm glad it's not above 50%, I think that's good, but still the fact that it's so large is mainly because of all the books I read for school. Majority of them were written by white authors, majority by white men, which I think is the fault of my AP literature teacher. I read it maybe 5 books for that class, and none of them were written by authors of color. I think one of them was written by a woman, and that was The Handmaid's Tale by Margaret Atwood, which is kind of, who's like the whitest woman of all time. And I didn't even like that book, so like, I'm a little mad at my AP Lit teacher. I feel like in 2023, this graph is going to look a lot different. And then I also recorded Language of Origin. Majority of the books I read were originally written in English. I mean, all of the books I read were in English because that's the only language I feel comfortable reading in. English is my native language. Technically, by the state of Maryland, I can speak and read Spanish, but in practice, not really. Although I do have a few books in Spanish on my shelf that if I read in 2023, I'd be really happy. I have a few books in Japanese too, but is that actually going to happen? Fat chance. That being said, of the English books that I read, I do really like translated fiction, and I want to be able to read books that were written from like around the world and from people from different cultures and perspectives. So that includes people who speak languages other than English. But majority of the books that I read were originally written in English. 5% were in Japanese, and 5% were in ancient Greek, because I read Sophocles and Sappho, so yeah. 2.5%, which was one book, was in Mandarin Chinese, and another book was Biblical Hebrew, which is the same Song of Songs book that I read for class, because I think that's the language that the Bible was written in. So in terms of like around the world, I also included like continents, because languages is one thing, but continents is another, to like kind of see where in the world these books are coming from. So these are not the continents that the book was written in, but the continents in which the book takes place. 56.4% of the books took place in North America, and I think all of that was the United States. 25.6% were from Europe, and that was mainly the UK. 12.8% were in Asia, 2.6% in Africa, and one book in Africa and one book in South America. What was the book I read that was in Africa? Oh, I read The Death of Vivek Oji, which takes place in Nigeria. But that was a good book. And then I read one book from South America, and that was also Akwaeke Emezi. That was You Made a Fool of Death with Your Beauty, which really doesn't count. I put it in South America because I didn't know where else to put it, but it doesn't count because it takes place on a fictional Caribbean island, so it's not even a real place. like it's literally just miscellaneous Caribbean island, so it really doesn't count. I definitely need to work on reading books from outside the Western Hemisphere. Apart from the authors, I also just wanted to take a look at how I was reading books. 75% of the books that I read were ebooks that I read either on my phone or my iPad or my Kobo e-reader. My e-reader literally saves my life. And then 25% of the books that I read were actual physical books, which I'm really, really surprised by. I'm surprised that majority of the books that I read were ebooks, because especially once I went to college, I live with a roommate now, and she goes to bed really early, so I normally read at night, so I can't really do that with like physical books. I can't read in the dark, so that's why I downloaded a few of my physical books onto my e-reader, and then I get a lot of my library books, I get all of my library books from Overdrive, and then I just downloaded them onto my e-reader. And then I can read them at night without a light, which is really, really convenient. But I do want to read more physical books in 2023. Not because I think I really do enjoy ebooks, it's just that I have bought so many physical books. Like I have so many physical books on my shelf that I have to read. Like I have to make use of that money. I cannot waste all that money. So hopefully I can get back into reading physical books, because I've noticed I've started to slow down. When I read a physical book, it takes me a lot longer to read that than it does an ebook. And I want to fix that so that I can at least get through my shelf, and then I can completely shift to digital if I need to. And then the sources, I purchased 42.5% of the books that I read. 45% were from the library, which was, I used the Libby app and then Overdrive on my e-reader, which Overdrive owns Libby, so it's literally the same thing, from my local library. And then 12.5% of the books that I read were downloaded. So you can figure out what that means. I think this is a really good ratio. I like this. I like that I get a lot of my books from the library. It's very nice to my wallet. Just that my library doesn't tend to have a lot of books. Like they never have the books that I want, like the really niche books, or like the books that are really popular. There's like a waiting list for months. I waited for The Death of Vivek Oji. I was on the wait list for 6 months before I got that book. And then I read it in one day because I waited until the last day to actually read, the last day of my loan to actually read it. Yeah. So those are my stats. Let me get a drink of water and then I'll be back to talk about my favorite books from this year. Okay. Let's get started. So number 11, we're starting off really strong with NP by Banana Yoshimoto. I rated this book 4 stars, but I wanted to include this on this list. So there's this writer, right? And he is Japanese, but he writes books in English, publish them overseas, and people want to translate it into Japanese so it can be published in Japan too, right? So they've translated 2 of his books, but the third one is the book that he wrote right before he commits suicide. And then what happens is when people are trying to translate this book into Japanese, everyone who tries to translate it also has commit suicide. So that's like 2 other people. And so it follows this girl who, after her boyfriend dies, trying to translate this 3rd novel by this writer, she decides to start translating it and ends up meeting his children. And it's just this kind of story of her reflecting on her life, reflecting on the author's life, reflecting on, the new people that she meets. And it's like really weird. Like it's weird, but I think it's incredible because I love Banana Yoshimoto. Like she's definitely become one of my favorite authors. I think it's just the way that she writes. Translated by Anne Sheriff. Yeah, Anne Sheriff does an incredible translation because I'm really able to capture Banana Yoshimoto's writing and to kind of understand it. But the way she writes about life is so beautiful. And even though this book is basically about suicide, like she just has such a beautiful perspective on life. And it makes me really glad to be alive and really glad to be human. And I think that's an incredible thing to accomplish as an author. And then number 10 is The Picture of Dorian Gray by Oscar Wilde. This was published in 1890, and it's incredible. I rated this 4.5 stars, and like This is probably one of my favorite classics ever. This is definitely my favorite book I've ever read for school. Like, this story is just so interesting. I love how the back it says Oscar Wilde's alluring novel of decadence and sin. Like, that's what this book is. I am someone who loves dramatics, and I feel like this book is kind of Shakespearean in a way, just because of how, like, dramatic it is. Like, it's kind of like a Greek tragedy in the ways that Dorian Gray is his own hubris. It's just like, wait, that sentence doesn't make sense. Dorian Gray's like hubris and how he is his own downfall. Like, it's just so dramatic and so interesting. I think I rated it 4.5 stars because I found this so funny. I think it's chapter 10 or something. It's the longest, most boring chapter I've ever read in my entire life in any book ever. Like, that chapter was so boring. He was just ranting about absolutely nothing. But then immediately after that chapter, the most interesting thing and like my favorite scene in the entire book, like incredible dramatics, like high stakes, like high adrenaline, like it's the most perfect and intense like dramatic scene follows immediately after the most boring chapter ever. And I hated and loved that. That's why I think Oscar Wilde is amazing, because I feel like he did that on purpose. He said, you have to trudge through the literal mud in order to get to the fun chapter. And then I think this book has the most satisfying ending of like any book ever. And then number 5 is You Made a Fool of Death with Your Beauty by Akwaeke and Emezi, are some of the YouTubers I'm subscribed to. You know, the booktubers, like, some of them really, really hate this book, and some of them really, really love this book, which is hilarious. I really do think it is a hit or miss, but I love it. It hit for me, okay? You Made a Fool of Death with Your Beauty is about this woman. Her husband has died, and it's like 5 years later or something. She's trying to get back into the dating scene. She's trying to gain back her life. She's learning to love again. You know what? I might as well tell you up front, because if you go into this book expecting a cute love story and then you find out what it's actually about, you'll probably be mad. So I'll be honest with you. She starts dating this guy. He takes her to this Caribbean island, his home, the place he was born, and she falls in love with his father. So that's what the book is about. Now that you know, you can set your expectations accordingly. If you don't want to read, like, she's an adult. She's like in her upper 20s, but still there's a huge age gap between them. So if that makes you uncomfortable, or if it makes you mad at the fact that she falls in love with her boyfriend's dad, don't read the book. You probably won't like it. I thought Akwaeke and Emezi, this was like their first romance that they'd written, and I felt the pacing was incredible, the relationship was believable, and it tells a really, really, really beautiful story about grief and just makes you look at love from a different perspective, which I think is really beautiful. Number 8 is Maurice, I don't know. Maurice by Forster, published in 1971, but written in 1914. I read this in my vlog. I also read You Made a Fool of Death with Your Beauty in my vlog. So if you want to check that out, you can do that. But yes, I absolutely love this book. I rated it 4.75 stars. Just because I didn't feel like it made it all the way to 5 stars, but I think it's beautiful. I think it's incredible. It's the story of this British boy kind of discovering his sexuality and learning, like a coming of age, like learning, growing into himself and learning his priorities and how he feels about his sexuality, which, it's just a great book. Like, I need more people to read it. It's like so good, and I need you to believe me, okay? Thank you. Number 7 is The Wicker King by Ancrum, published in 2017. When I tell you this book is so good, I had this book on my list for years, and then I never actually touched it until this year because it was available at my library. And then I immediately rented it and started reading it, and from the first page I was like, oh, I'm gonna love this book, aren't I? I'm gonna love this book. We're in high school in the US, and it's set in the early 2000s. I think it's set in 2002 or something, which I think is an incredible setting, by the way. So The Wicker King is about these two boys who are best friends, but they're like too close of best friends that they're like massively codependent on each other. And then one of the boys starts to have these hallucinations and starts to kind of detach from reality. And like, it's just an incredible character study, story of, frankly, child neglect, a story about these boys who literally no one else cared about, so they had to care for each other. And that is like it's just an incredible story. And I think what made it a 5-star book for me is actually the author's note at the end. Ancrum wrote an incredible author's note at the end that once I got there, I just kept going like, yes, yes, yes. I feel like this book is incredible, and the reasons why it was written is incredible, and I definitely think it needs to be read, because like, it's just so good, and you have to believe me. I'm gonna say that so many times. Next is The Downstairs Girl by Stacey Lee, published in 2019. I love this book. This book has everything I love about historical fiction. I think this book was the reason why I say that my favorite genre is historical fiction. So it's about this Chinese American girl in Atlanta in the 1890s, I believe, which, by the way, is my favorite era to read historical fiction from. It's called The Downstairs Girl because this girl lives in the basement of this family that owns a publishing house, because she lives in the basement with another Chinese American man who pretty much raises her. So they're hiding there. The family doesn't know that they live like under their house. I think it was like a basement that was built during the era of the Underground Railroad, so it's always been a secret. So when the family that owns the publishing house, when they moved in, they didn't realize that the basement existed, but it's been used to house these Chinese American or Asian American immigrants so that they can work in the city and get some money to move on to their next place. The girl's name is Jo. She initially works in a hat shop, but then she's fired because the owner of the hat shop is like, we don't need your exotic face in the window. People are gonna get the wrong idea. She's fired for being Chinese American, and then she has to go back to her old job that she had working as a maid, or at least like a caretaker for this rich family that are like terrible to her. She starts sending these letters to the son of the publishing company family, to the son of the people who live above her. She starts writing this advice panel, submitting this anonymous like advice panel for their newspaper to boost their ratings so that she can give all the ladies of the town like advice. Like, the plot is so interesting. Jo as a character is just incredible to follow. All of the side characters are really, really interesting. There's like a plot twist towards the end that I did not see coming at all. Like, I should have been less surprised by it. I should have seen it coming, but I didn't. And then the ending of this book is really, really satisfying too. So I absolutely love this book. It's like perfect because it's a diverse historical fiction, and it chronicles some real events. Number 5 is Notes of a Crocodile by Chu Maojin. Is Notes of a Crocodile by Chu Maojin. When I tell you, I knew I would love this book when I first heard of it, and then I read it, and I did love it. It's considered like a cult classic, and I completely understand why. It was published in 1994, translated by Bonnie Hu from Mandarin Chinese. This is definitely not going to be the last time that I read this book. I think this book needs to be read over and over and over and studied. This book is about a teenager in 1980s Taipei, and she is a lesbian and feels so incredibly outcasted and uncomfortable with her sexuality, and it kind of just follows all 4 years of her college experience. Like, the writing is really, really good. It's devastating. You have to be warned. It is devastating. It contains a lot of internalized homophobia. I'm just so glad that Chu Maojin left us with this, because she did commit suicide, I think, a year after this book was published. And I wish we could have gotten more from her, but I'm glad that we did get this, because it's so true and beautiful. You know? Read Notes of a Crocodile. Number 4 is Excuse Me While I Ugly Cry by Joya Goffney. I love this book, and I love talking about this book. You can see me read it for the first time in my vlog that I posted before this video. Yes, this is a YA romance. I don't think I can explain it really well, at least not fast enough. And I think it's an incredible book. Yes. Number 3 is True Biz by Sara Novic. Sara Novic? This is definitely one of the best books published in 2022. Although I didn't read a lot of new releases, I should be honest. But I do think this is one of the best ones. Follows 3 characters, 2 characters that attend, and 1 principal, like the principal of this deaf school, like this deaf boarding school. Is that what they're called? If you like Celeste Ng, I think you will love this book. I like Celeste Ng and I love this book. Basically what's happening is one of the characters, she's deaf, but she grew up, but her family is hearing, and she grew up in like a hearing school, grew up in a public school surrounded by hearing people, never learned sign language, and then she ends up transferring to this deaf school, and she's like culture shock, where now she's surrounded by people who are deaf like her, but they all speak a different language. She doesn't know ASL, so she kind of has to learn it. We follow this other deaf boy who he's deaf, but his entire family is deaf. So he's been raised in deaf culture and raised with ASL, and he knows all this. He's super popular at the school, like he's the it boy. Like the principal, we follow her, she's hearing, but she grew up with deaf parents, I believe. And she's the principal of this school, and she's trying to save it because the school is being shut down. That was a roundabout way of explaining this book. Like, it has discussion points throughout the book that I think are really important for deaf and hearing people alike. It talks about cochlear implants and autonomy for disabled people, which it's just like, these are discussions that we need to have. These are discussions that we need to center disabled voices to be able to give them the human rights that they deserve. Because I feel like a lot of people don't realize how badly disabled people and how badly deaf people are treated in American culture. And then number 2 is Annie on My Mind by Nancy Garden, published in 1982. I am so glad that I found this book. It's so genuine and authentic is the word that I kept using to describe this book in my book journal. This is one of the first books to ever be published to have a positive lesbian relationship. It's about these two teenage girls in New York City who fall in love. And it's just really beautiful. It doesn't even feel outdated. It doesn't feel old. It doesn't feel like I kind of expected it to, I guess. I feel like it still has relevance. I think I might read this book again because it just made me so happy and I love it so much. I think I need to read it again. That being said, let's move on to my number one favorite book of the year. It was hard for me to make this list. I had to think about it a lot, and I think all of these books are really, really close together because I enjoyed them all. Regardless of if I gave them 4 or 5 stars, I think they're all incredible, and I hold them really, really close to my heart. But I do think that this was the number one book of this year, or the book that I read in 2022, and it was the second book that I read in 2022. And it followed me from February when I read it until January 2023. I'm still thinking about it. And that is Last Night at the Telegraph Club by Malinda Lo, published in 2021. I love historical fiction, right? I love lesbians, right? So this is everything I could have ever wanted, right? In the 1950s? I should have looked this up. Okay, but yes, it is set in 1950s San Francisco about this girl named Lily, and she is discovering her sexuality, and she finds an ad for this nightclub in the newspaper, so she ends up going to it. It's called the Telegraph Club, so it's kind of just her and another girl that she goes to school with. They're like unlikely friends because she's Chinese and there's this white girl that she starts hanging out with without like letting anyone know. And the two of them go to this lesbian bar. The best coming of age, the best historical fiction. Everything I love about books is in this book. And it's a beautiful story and a beautiful romance, and I felt so incredibly immersed the entire time. I read this book while I was driving down to Atlanta. 1950s San Francisco lesbians, like, is that not enough for you to go read it? Like, okay, whatever. It not only talks about the lesbian scene in the 1950s, but what it was like to be a Chinese immigrant, but also to try and get into lesbian culture, which was very white at the time. Like Lily talks about like being the only ethnic face in that bar, and like, yes, she's finally found people who are like her, finally found people who are queer like her, but none of them look like her, and she experiences racism. So before my battery dies, I'm gonna thank you for watching this video. I'm gonna say good luck in 2023 with all of your goals, reading and otherwise, and I hope to see y'all next year. Hopefully I'll make more videos by then, but I hope to see y'all next year to see how I did in 2023. So peace and love, and human rights are good. Bye!